Hello everyone, today's video is presented by me with Loki, as usual, and we'll be talking about Mozart and the French Revolution a little bit. So the piece under investigation is his wonderful late D major Minuet, and not a particularly famous piece, although it has been made famous by one or two things, particularly Tchaikovsky's arrangement of it in his suite Mozartiana for orchestra. And it's a piece that is often commented on and analysed for lots of interesting reasons, and we'll look into that in a minute. But first of all, let's talk just for a few minutes about Mozart and the French Revolution. This piece was written in 1789, around the time of the French Revolution, and you don't immediately associate Mozart with the French Revolution, but actually he was a key player in a way, not directly, but he wrote two, possibly three operas that I might say feed into the atmosphere that brought about the French Revolution, the enlightened atmosphere of the late 18th century. The first of those operas is the Marriage of Figaro, in which servants and people working for a count, for an aristocrat, get the better of their unscrupulous and philandering master. So it's an opera in which the ordinary people overcome the aristocracy. Second opera, which immediately followed it, also in collaboration with his librettist Del Ponce, and equally famous, and we've talked about it on this channel, is Don Giovanni. And that too is an opera that is all about a thoroughly unpleasant, predatory nobleman called Don Giovanni who goes around seducing women and eventually gets into terrible trouble and ends up going to hell and is dragged down at the end of the opera. So again, we're talking about the conventional behaviour of noblemen in the 18th century, just sort of casually seducing, possibly raping women of lower social orders, and that happens in the opera. Mozart exposes it. And the third opera that I think feeds into the French Revolution to some extent, although it postdates it, but it seems to me to be a sort of possible allegorical comment on the French Revolution, is Mozart's last operatic masterpiece, The Magic Flute. And in it, the Queen of the Night could be seen, and no one really knows, but the Queen of the Night would appear to be, perhaps, an allegorical representation of the Ancien Régime, the old regime, the old aristocratic order, and she is defeated by the new enlightened order that's represented by the priesthood of Sarastro. So there we go, three possible contenders for revolutionary operas in Mozart's output. But also on the small level of his instrumental music, I would say that there's something very, not politically, but musically revolutionary going on around this period. 1789, we have featured another piece on this channel called the Little Gigue, which was written that year, which features these extraordinary, what might be called proto-serial thematic ideas that have all 12 chromatic notes. And here's another one. The Minuet in D is highly chromatic. So let me just show you what I mean by that. Do you remember that scene in Amadeus in which Salieri fictionally plays a little minuet, and then Mozart comes in and improvises on Salieri's minuet and turns it into a famous aria from The Marriage of Figaro?
The rest is just the same, isn't it?
Well, let's do something similar. Imagine I played you a sort of standard 18th century formulaic minuet, and I did it something like this. So you have an opening phrase and an answering phrase with a half cadence. Now listen to what Mozart does with that sort of formula. He subverts it by using all sorts of chromatic elements, in other words, semitones, moving around both in the bass and the upper voices, the parallel thirds, and creates these fascinating, slithery harmonic movements, which are slightly, more than slightly subversive. They undermine the clear tonality in a way that actually looks forward to the sort of thing Wagner did almost 70, 80 years later. Here's Mozart's version. Isn't that extraordinary? So, for example, the second chord is an augmented triad, a very strange chord, very unstable chord to have in the first bar. And everything takes the form of a kind of appoggiatura, a leaning note. Harmonies result out of notes that lean into dissonances. An augmented chord leads into another dissonance and a second dissonance, and then finally resolves, but then the bass shifts. So this kind of thing where the harmony is constantly shifting and altering in a chromatic way. Second phrase, slightly more straightforward, but very chromatic, with the upper voices moving in parallel thirds chromatically. But here's something extraordinary. Then we go to the third phrase, and you're completely unprepared for this. So, second phrase, and it's Marx forzando, it has an accent on it. So there's this extraordinary emphasis, again on an augmented chord. What you're expecting is D major. And then it would carry on in an 18th century manner. That doesn't happen. And a very chromatic phrase where inner voices are moving chromatically, and then the top voice, we move around the circle of fifths. Second phrase also starts with an accented augmented chord, and again moves chromatically through the circle of fifths. And the third suggests D minor, the tonic turned into the minor, and then an Italian sixth, an augmented sixth, and then finally, as if nothing was untoward, we arrive on the dominant. Extraordinary, masterful use of highly advanced chromaticism. I mentioned Wagner a minute ago. If you think of the beginning of Tristan, the famous opening, with its chromatic appoggiaturas, and then I play you this, really not very far away, but starts playing around with very complex harmonic progressions. A fact that Wagner actually acknowledged in Cosima, his wife's diary. Wagner does talk about Mozart, hinting at the kind of harmony that he developed later. So, there is a connection. And it starts with Mozart, the revolution, in other words, of harmonic chromaticism in the 19th century is really initiated by this sort of densely chromatic writing in Mozart. One more thing to say about these augmented chords. If you take the second chord in the first bar, this augmented triad, and then you take the first accented augmented triad, and the second accented augmented triad, and then the third, all three, that adds up to the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. In other words, it's almost as if, quite systematically, Mozart has lined up all 12 notes. And do you remember we had something very similar when we looked at the Little Gigue a few weeks ago, with its incredibly chromatically saturated material, and indeed the G minor symphony, and there are various other pieces of Mozart that do this, as if he was quite aware that he was using all 12 chromatic notes in his music. The structure of the piece is rather fascinating. This, rather like the Little Gigue, is in a kind of binary form, which means that you have two repeating halves. The second half is a bit more complicated than the first half. I have a theory, but it's complete speculation, that the Little Gigue, which was written the same year in Leipzig, and this minuet may have been intended for some kind of dance suite, almost like a Baroque style dance suite, which Mozart never completed. He'd already written a suite several years earlier in Baroque style, and I think he might have been assembling in his spare time. He didn't have much, but whenever he had a spare minute, it seems as if perhaps he was writing a little piece that might then fit into a suite. I don't know, but the pieces are similar, spiritually similar, or artistically there's some kind of binding thing that seems to me to join them together, much more impressively than the common thinking among musicologists, which is that this minuet was intended for Mozart's final sonata in D major. I don't think that's the case, because Mozart never wrote a four-movement sonata, and I don't see why he would have suddenly intended to do so now. There's nothing about that sonata that feels as if it needs a fourth movement. So anyway, that's me speculating. Anyway, let's get back to structure. It's kind of in binary form, but it's also in a kind of miniature sonata form. So if you go from the cadence that I just got to, we get into a little second subject. Lovely. And diatonic. No chromaticism at all. Absolutely straightforward, simple, popular in style. Haydn pioneered this kind of approach in his symphonies, where you have a more cerebral material for your first subject, and then when you come into the second subject, you give the people a nice tune. And it's a good strategy to just win over the audience. And I think actually that's what he's doing. Mozart had a reputation in his lifetime for being difficult, for writing music that was for the cognoscenti and was a little bit complicated. And this minuet is absurdly complicated, really, by 18th century standards. So even Mozart feels he just has to back off a little bit and give people a nice tune. I mean, why not? Mozart's very good at nice tunes. So that's what the second subject is. And then he hits you with this terrifying thing, because you just come to the end of the second subject, and the minuet repeats, and then suddenly he hits you with this terrifying dissonance, unprepared dissonance. So on the top you've got this chromatic line, slow chromatic line, fantastic. Underneath, do you remember the parallel thirds at the beginning? So you've got the slow chromatic line, underneath you've got the parallel thirds, sort of slithering around. It's one of the most incredible things in the entire 18th century, this. And then underneath, so fantastic, a sort of rhythmic turbulence, because underneath the smooth top, you've got this weird response in the bass, and that in itself is a kind of hemiola. 1, 2, 3. The next thing he does is he takes those first two notes, the C and to the B, and he turns it into a sort of cross-rhythmic sequence round the circle of fifths until it reaches G, and then it goes shooting off climactically into this stream of octaves, which then goes minor, and then hits the dominant, and then recap. But the recap, as always with Mozart, is different. It contains these strange new counterpoints, imitations. Now, this is the point where the musicologist and forte pianist Robert Levin has suggested that Mozart's manuscript may have broken off. We don't know, because we don't have Mozart's manuscript. It doesn't exist. The piece was first published by Mozart's friend, the priest and musician Maximilian Stadler. The first edition of this piece has the minuet by Mozart and then a new trio section by Stadler. But we don't actually know if Mozart didn't leave the minuet itself unfinished. In other words, reaching this point of recapitulation, which he quite often did, and then leaving it because he knew what he wanted to do. He'd reached the recap. It was simply a matter of finishing it off, and he knew what he was going to do. But he may have left the manuscript incomplete at this point. If this conjecture is correct, it's quite possible that the next bit is by Maximilian Stadler, who basically just takes the whole thing, transposes it to the subdominant, the augmented chords, so it's all basically the same as the original until it reaches the tonic, and then it cadences, and we have this second subject, and it ends. I remember, and I've always thought this since I first learned this piece, isn't that a bit disappointing? There's something conventional about it. And there's something that isn't particularly inventive in the way that Mozart would be, because he's always inventive with recapitulations. Isn't it likely that Mozart did something different? And therefore, I have improvised a solution that I think works better than Stadler. This is all speculative. I'm sure many people will disagree, and that's fine. And you can say so if you want to. But I have improvised a new solution, which brings back the main theme at the very end. Have a listen, see what you think. Mozart's Minuet in D. Oh, one more thing to say. This channel is only a small channel, but we're doing well, and we're very grateful for the 30,000 plus subscribers that we now have. Please consider becoming a patron, because this channel benefits enormously from donations, and we'd really appreciate your support. Thank you.